On the 5th of April 1933, the land of the free officially became the land of the confiscated. Imagine waking up as a law-abiding American citizen, only to realize that the two $20 gold coins hidden in your dresser have just made you a federal felon. Under Executive Order 6102, President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared private gold ownership illegal, punishable by 10 years in a federal penitentiary. This was not a desperate temporary measure to fix a broken economy. It was a cold, calculated surgical strike that birthed the modern debt-based world we inhabit today. The system is not broken. It is operating exactly as it was designed in those smoke-filled rooms nearly a century ago. The patterns of 1933 are screaming at us in 2026, yet most people are still deaf to the noise. If you believe your digital wealth is any safer than their physical gold was, you haven't opened the right file yet. To understand the chains being forged today, we must first look at the ancient technology used to break them. To the uninitiated, debt appears to be a simple financial obligation, a mathematical contract between borrower and lender. But open the classified files of history, and a darker structure emerges. Debt is not merely a tool for commerce. It is the primary mechanism for social control and the unseen architect of political power. Today, we are opening 4 specific case files that the mainstream narrative prefers to keep sealed. We will examine the ancient Jubilee, a lost technology where kings erased ledgers to prevent societal collapse. We will dissect the Great Depression, a global crime scene where the gold standard transformed a recession into a decade of misery. We will re-examine the hyperinflationary collapses of Weimar and Zimbabwe, proving they were not caused by printing presses but by the death of institutions. And finally, the forgotten default of 1979. These events are not random accidents. They are evidence of a recurring timeline that is about to loop again. When the ledger becomes mathematically impossible to balance, the system does not negotiate. History offers only 2 choices: reset the system or enslave the population. The ancients understood this physics better than your Federal Reserve chairman does today, and their solution was far more radical than anything Wall Street would dare to whisper. Imagine standing in the court of Babylon in the 2nd millennium B.C., watching a king smash the clay tablets of debt into dust. Modern economists dismiss the ancient Jubilee as a utopian fantasy, a charitable act of religious forgiveness, but they are analyzing the data upside down. These ancient rulers were not saints. They were ruthless pragmatists who understood a mathematical truth that Wall Street ignores. When the debt burden crushed the peasantry, the economy didn't just stall, it died. So they operationalized the clean slate. Upon the ascent of a new monarch, 3 specific gears of the machine were reversed. First, the crushing agricultural debts owed by the citizens were voided. Second, bondservants, wives, and children forced into slavery to pay off family loans were unchained and returned home. Third, and most dangerous to the elite, the land pledged as collateral was seized from the creditors and returned to its original owners. But do not mistake this for socialism. The forensic evidence reveals a critical exception. Commercial debts, the business loans between merchants denominated in silver, were never touched. This was not a bailout for risky speculation. It was a targeted strike to protect the working class from the financial predators. They distinguished between productive credit and parasitic usury. The king knew that if the creditor class grew too powerful, they would rival the throne itself. This mechanism kept the oligarchy in check for centuries. But eventually, the creditors found a way to stop the clock. Picture the map of an ancient empire, held together not by loyalty, but by cold, hard logistics. The Jubilee was never about mercy. It was a calculated act of survival for the state. To the king, a citizen drowning in interest payments was a useless asset. If a farmer loses his land to a foreclosure, he ceases to be a productive taxpayer. Even worse, he can no longer afford the armor and weapons required to serve in the infantry. A nation of debt slaves is a nation with no army, leaving the palace gates wide open for invasion. The ruler faced a binary choice: cancel the private debts owed to the wealthy elite or watch his kingdom be dismantled by foreign swords. By pressing the reset button, the monarch effectively decapitated the rising financial class before they could become a rival government. It prevented the merchants from coalescing into a creditor oligarchy capable of challenging the throne. It was a brutal, effective check and balance system that prioritized the physical survival of the population over the abstract profits of the few. The Jubilee was the ultimate anti-monopoly weapon, a nuclear option against financial centralization. But weapons are only useful as long as you have the political will to fire them. Eventually, the creditors realized they did not need to defeat the king on the battlefield. They just needed to rewrite the rules of the game. Imagine the marble halls of the Roman Senate not as a beacon of democracy, but as a crime scene where the concept of human freedom was quietly murdered by compound interest. As the center of gravity shifted westward from the Near East to Greece and Rome, a fatal error was coded into the economic operating system. The ancient safety valve of the Jubilee was welded shut, and a new, lethal directive was installed: the sanctity of debt. For the first time, the financial obligation was elevated above the biological survival of the citizen. The consequences were immediate, violent, and irreversible. Power hemorrhaged from the state to a ruthless oligarchy of absentee landlords who replaced the king's protection with the foreclosure notice. The political arena turned into a slaughterhouse. Reformers like the Gracchi brothers, who dared to propose reinstating the debt reset, were not voted out of office. They were assassinated in the streets by the private enforcers of the creditor class. Historians like Livy and Plutarch documented this slow-motion suicide, noting how the elite used fraud and force to strip the population of their assets, leaving the empire hollowed out from within. Rome fell not because of barbarian strength, but because its own citizens had nothing left to defend. The lesson is terrifyingly simple. When a society deletes the ability to forgive unpayable debt, it chooses its own execution. Rome proved that a debt that cannot be reset will eventually consume the host. 2,000 years later, an economist named Irving Fisher would finally decode the mathematical mechanics of this self-destruction. Imagine a trap so devious that the harder you struggle to escape, the tighter the chains bind your hands. In 1933, while the ashes of the economy were still smoldering, an economist named Irving Fisher stared into the abyss and decoded the terrifying physics of the debt deflation spiral. He identified a 9-step doom loop that begins with a completely rational act: liquidation. When the market turns, debtors panic and sell assets to pay off their loans. But when everyone rushes for the exit at the exact same moment, prices collapse in a violent fire sale. This destruction of asset values wipes out bank deposits, causing the currency supply to contract and prices to free fall. Here is the cruel twist that defies all common sense. As money vanishes from the system, the remaining dollars become rare and therefore more valuable. This deflation means that even though you are frantically paying down the nominal number of dollars you owe, the real purchasing power of your remaining debt is actually rising faster than you can pay it. Fisher proved a paradox that shatters conventional wisdom. The very act of mass repayment causes the total debt burden to grow larger, not smaller. It is a financial black hole where solvency is mathematically impossible. In this specific cycle, doing the responsible thing becomes the trigger for collective suicide. Paying back your debt might be the very thing that destroys the economy. This was the hidden engine that powered the 1930s collapse. But to turn a local recession into a global catastrophe, it needed a transmission mechanism to infect the entire world. It was not merely a market correction. It was a synchronized global massacre. By 1932, the pulse of the world economy had flatlined, with global GDP plummeting by 15% and 1 in 4 able-bodied American men standing in breadlines, stripped of their dignity. While the streets filled with the desperate, the ivory towers of academia were locked in a bitter war to identify the murder weapon. The monetarists, led by Milton Friedman, pointed the finger at the Federal Reserve, accusing them of suffocating the money supply during a critical seizure. The Keynesians argued it was a collapse of animal spirits, a psychological failure where the loss of confidence killed aggregate demand. But it was Fisher's debt deflation model that described the actual mechanics of the bleeding. What turned this American tragedy into a planetary plague was the gold standard. Far from being a shield, gold acted as a lethal straitjacket, chaining the world's economies together and forcing nations to import each other's deflation to protect their reserves. Governments locked in this golden cage had no key to release the pressure, exporting misery across borders until trade collapsed by 50%. The system was rigged so that stability for the banks meant starvation for the people. But as we dissect this wreckage, we encounter a pervasive myth that refuses to die: the belief that the government printing press is the ultimate villain. To understand why this is a lie, we must reopen the cold case of the Weimar Republic. There is a lazy narrative sold to the public that hyperinflation is simply the result of a corrupt government hitting the print button too many times. This is a dangerous simplification that masks the true pathology of a collapsing currency. Hyperinflation is not a monetary policy error. It is the death rattle of a failed state. Zoom in on the crime scene of Weimar Germany in 1923. The history books blame war reparations, but the forensic accounting reveals a far more sinister culprit. The Reichsbank was not under government control. It had been privatized under Allied demand. It was a private central bank that fueled the inferno, issuing unlimited credit to private speculators who were actively shorting their own national currency. The government didn't kill the mark. The private banking sector assassinated it for profit. Now, fast forward to the catastrophe of Zimbabwe. The hyperinflation did not begin because of a sudden desire to print paper. It began because the regime seized the commercial farms, destroying the agricultural backbone of the economy. When a nation's ability to produce goods drops to zero, and its tax base evaporates, the currency becomes worthless before the ink even hits the paper. In both cases, the printing press was not the cause of death. It was merely the life support system plugged into a corpse. Hyperinflation is the symptom of institutional suicide, proving that you cannot fix a broken economy with more liquidity. But if we cannot print our way out of the next crash, and we cannot default without destroying the global banking system, there is only one option left on the table. A solution so radical it requires redefining the concept of ownership itself. Imagine hitting the reset button on the global debt ledger today. It sounds liberating until you realize the trap we have built. In the ancient world, kings could wipe the slate clean because they were the ultimate creditors. But today, your debt is someone else's asset. If we cancel your mortgage, we instantly destroy the pension fund that owns the mortgage-backed security, wiping out the retirement savings of millions. We are locked in a financial suicide pact where salvation for the borrower means annihilation for the saver. But there is a backdoor out of this prison, a concept buried in the policy papers called state equity participation. The solution is not to destroy the debt, but to convert it into equity, transforming the citizen from a serf into a partner. Instead of chaining a generation of students to compound interest, the state invests in them like a venture capitalist, taking a percentage of future earnings rather than demanding fixed payments from a jobless graduate. In the housing market, the government stops playing the role of the predatory lender and becomes a silent partner, owning a 15% equity stake in your home to lower the barrier to entry. This shifts the systemic risk from the fragile individual to the broad shoulders of the state. To fund this revolution, we target the one asset class that produces nothing but unearned wealth: land. A land value tax captures the passive profits of the elite, recycling their rent-seeking back into the productive economy. It is a brilliant mathematical solution to the debt crisis, but it relies on one fragile variable: the absolute trustworthiness of the United States government. And in 1979, that trust was shattered by a glitch that almost nobody remembers. It was the spring of 1979, and the most dangerous threat to the American economy was not the Soviet Union or the oil crisis, but a jammed word processor in the back office of the U.S. Treasury. In a blunder that history has conveniently scrubbed from the textbooks, the government failed to redeem a mere $120 million in maturing Treasury bills due to a technical glitch and a heavy workload. It was a microscopic error in a multi-trillion-dollar ocean, yet the reaction was immediate and violent. The illusion of the risk-free rate was shattered in an instant. Investors, realizing that the United States government was technically capable of default, panic sold their bonds, driving interest rates up by 60 basis points and permanently embedding a default premium into the cost of American debt. That single clerical error cost the American taxpayer billions of dollars in excess interest payments over the following years. Now, project that fragility onto the geopolitical minefield of 2026. We are no longer dealing with a small technical glitch. We are facing a global crisis of confidence where foreign creditors are actively dumping U.S. debt. If a simple delay in 1979 could spike borrowing costs and rattle the foundation of the bond market, imagine what happens when the world stops trusting the dollar entirely. The computer is not just jammed, the screen is about to go black. And when the system finally reboots, the balance you see in your account might be very different from the one you remember. Stare at the U.S. debt clock spinning out of control, and you are looking at a ghost. It is the exact same mathematical curve that appeared in the Roman Empire just before the currency lost its silver content and the legions disbanded. History has proven one absolute law. The system never saves the citizen, it only saves itself. Franklin Roosevelt did not confiscate American gold in 1933 to protect your savings. He seized it to capitalize the banks and bail out the Federal Reserve. Do not let them sell you the fantasy of a soft landing. In a terminal debt deflation cycle, there is no landing, there is only a crash site. The reset is not a possibility, it is a mathematical certainty waiting for a trigger. The file is now open. The patterns are undeniable. The only variable left is what you are actually holding in your hand when the reset button is finally pushed. If you found value in this historical autopsy, type the number 1 in the comments. Subscribe to Financial Money History for the next chapter they don't want you to read.